Well, surprise, surprise. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, crocaholics around the world, you are getting another podcast from your boy, Kenneth the K-Rock Cline. Episode 48 of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with the K-Rock is out. And folks, I never thought I was going to be able to do 3 podcasts this week, but I got to tell you what. It's probably a bit of a light week for me, although we had a Lamar University women's basketball home game that I had to cover on Wednesday. And, of course, I have to do another one this coming Sunday. So, over the next, let's see, maybe the next week or so after this, you might see a couple more podcasts from me because I know we're going to be a little bit busy, with a little traveling later on next week. But I have some time to do a podcast here. And folks, before we get into what I want to talk about for this occasion, I have some news. Guess who contacted me? After all this time, my co-host from Two Pals on a Pod, Mark T. Robinson. And in fact, folks, he contacted me and said, hey man, I want to get back to working on a podcast. And I was like, where the heck have you been, son? Where have you been, man? And obviously he's got a lot going on, but folks, we are working to see if we can get a podcast out for y'all on my other podcast, Two Pals on a Pod, which you can listen to on Buzzsprout, Spotify, as well as Apple Podcasts in a way. On this podcast, though, Krocking, Locking, and Dropping, you can listen to it on my YouTube channel, KWCline 91. That's KW Cline 91, along with Spotify and Podbean. So those are the sites that I use to put out podcasts like this. So yeah, I'm getting set to potentially have 2 podcasts going out soon on 2 different shows. But anyways, folks, we got another podcast we need to talk about here. And, I'm going to be real honest with you. This podcast is going to continue to be a bit of a Houston thing because, the last couple of episodes, I referred to the Al-Aziz Shair suspension, whether or not, you agreed with the amount of games he was suspended with. He's been suspended for 3 games. They appealed it, and unfortunately, he lost that appeal. So, as it turns out, he is going to be, serving his 3-game suspension beginning next Sunday when they take on the Miami Dolphins in a gauntlet game as well. But I was going to talk about the Houston Texans, because of a documentary that I watched and why I think this could potentially be something that might spark the Texans into a potential playoff run, perhaps, but we'll wait and see on that. However, folks, I want to start off this podcast by talking about a losing streak that is going on here. And, folks, it's really hard for me as a Rockets fan to admit this, but the Rockets have a losing streak. Now, they lost on a 2-game losing streak, but that's not the losing streak that I'm talking about here. The losing streak that I'm talking about here is that tonight, the Rockets lost to the Golden State Warriors, who were playing without Steph Curry and Draymond Green. And for the Rockets, it is the 15th consecutive loss to the Golden State Warriors. 15 games in a row, the Rockets have lost to Golden State. And the streak started all the way back on March 17th, 2021. Golden State won that game 108-94. And when you look at this losing streak, I'm looking at statmuse.com, which has all the statistical information about records and, schedules and, all that stuff. I look at this head-to-head stuff for the Rockets over the last 14 games. And, including this game tonight, which I know they'll probably update. But over the last 14 games prior to tonight, which the Rockets lost, it has not been very kind to Houston in a way. And Houston's just lost to Golden State 15 straight times in a row. It was a 5-point loss tonight, but when you look back at this losing streak, the majority of these games, the Rockets were nowhere close to beating Golden State. Let's look at this schedule here. So I'm counting down. I see a 2-point loss here in January 21st, 2022. I don't know if I would count a 7-point loss as a close game. So then I'm looking here. a 5-point loss to Golden State November 20th, 2023, and then most recently, prior to tonight, a 6-point loss to Golden State, 127-121 in overtime. That was the game the Rockets overcame a 31-point deficit to force overtime, but Golden State ended up winning that game. So clearly right now, it is safe to say Golden State has had our number over the last 3 years. And, well, you look back and you could say Golden State's been that way since their incredible dynasty run began back in 2015. And, look, it's very frustrating as a Rockets fan when you can't seem to figure out how to beat Golden State, whether it be in a playoff series or whether it be in a regular season game as well. But when you look at this streak as a whole, you can't really be surprised by it because the Rockets from 2021 to 2000 and, till last season, they were a team that had some talent, but they didn't have a direction to go to. I mean, this was a Rockets team that was coached by Steven Silas, who, God bless the guy for trying, but he just wasn't the kind of coach that was expected to, turn this team around. And, I mean, he tried, but the Rockets were just not that great. I mean, they've had some years where they didn't even win 20 games in that stretch. And this goes all the way back to when James Harden, after multiple opportunities to try and win a championship for Houston, but didn't even make it to the NBA Finals, was like, it's not going to happen here, so I go my own way. And, well, we know what's happened to Harden in his career. It has not worked out for him as well. But the unfortunate thing about that is when you lose a superstar caliber player like James Harden, you have to, return some draft value. And for the Rockets, that was basically a sign that this was going to be a very tough stretch and some tough years. And sure enough, that is exactly what's happened. The Rockets have arguably been the worst team in NBA history for 3 years. Well, I say the worst team. I'm pretty sure there have been some worse teams, but one of the worst teams in the NBA history for the last few seasons in the NBA. I mean, of course, the Rockets have been in contention for draft lotteries for number 1 picks. They haven't won the number 1 pick, but they have picked number 2, number 3, and number 4 over the last few draft picks in the NBA. So clearly, the Rockets' losing streak is understandable to Golden State because they've been rebuilding. They've been trying to rebuild their team to potentially be in a position to contend. And Houston's obviously had some struggles, last 2 games, losing to Sacramento with some controversial calls. I won't get into that much, although it wasn't really a friendly day for Houston sports. Wednesday, as the Rockets, or actually it was on Tuesday when it happened, the Rockets lost to Kings, and then, of course, Coach Ime Udoka was like, tell the referees to get some bleeping glasses on with all these calls, and he and, a number of players got ejected or technical fouls and all that, but it's just been a really rough stretch for Houston sports lately. But, yeah, but when you look at this losing streak that the Rockets have been on to Golden State, it's very understandable. Because Houston by no means is in a position to potentially overtake Golden State. And, I mean, until the last few games, they kind of were in it, but they just haven't been able to figure that out. And, look, Golden State, without question, has been one of the best teams in the NBA. Now, there have been a couple years where Golden State had not played like it, but they've always been the strong point. They've always been the best NBA franchise, at least in the 21st century. I mean, you can argue, you could say the Spurs, maybe the Lakers, but Golden State's just been playing lights out. I mean, Curry and Draymond Green, who has his fair share of controversial moments, shall we say, it's just hard to figure them out. And, I mean, there's really no way of, saying that you lost to Golden State because, well, eventually it's Golden State. And this, you feel like it's an opportunity for the Rockets to eventually find a way to beat Golden State, even if it's a regular season game. Tonight, of course, Curry wasn't playing, Green wasn't playing, and yet the Rockets still lost. They just weren't, they fell behind, and they were missing Tari Eason, who was out with an injury. I mean, this is a Rockets team that at some point, you have to say that they're going to find a way to beat Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors. Now, they have another opportunity to do that in a couple of days, as they will be taking on the Warriors in the quarterfinals of the NBA Cup, which has been a new thing as well. So that should be something. And, of course, Houston's hosting that game. So hopefully the Rockets can be able to get themselves going and try to find a way, to put it into this losing streak. But I was just thinking about this. I was thinking about the Rockets' losing streak because it's so frustrating, like, when you have this massive losing streak against one team. There comes a point in time when, it can have a massive effect on you psychologically, negatively or positively. I mean, from the Rockets' perspective, they've been battling hard. They've tried to go up against Golden State. There have been games where they've been close but haven't been able to get the job to beat them. And then other games, they just haven't been able to show up, and Golden State's just been toying around with them. But you have to think that at some point, the Warriors are feeling the pressure. Every single time they play the Rockets, there has to be some pressure creeping up. Now, I'm not saying the Warriors are thinking, we got to win. Like, this is a must-win game, because we got to keep this winning streak alive, because eventually at some point we're going to lose. Yeah. No. The Warriors are not thinking that it's a pressure game. They're playing basketball. But the fact is, when you win 15 games in a row against a certain team, there is a certain level of pressure that kind of creeps right in to the forefront. And eventually, the streak is going to come to an end. That's the reality of it. So, I mean, Golden State has won 15 straight games against Houston, but you have to think that at some point, the Rockets will find a way to beat Golden State. And that may be the next game. Maybe not. But if it's not the next game, then you have to think at some point that the Rockets will figure out a way to beat the Warriors as well. Now, of course, the Rockets will play Golden State again Wednesday, December 11th for the NBA Cup in the quarterfinals. Then, at some point, checking the schedule here to see if the Rockets are playing Golden State February 13th, one day before Valentine's Day, which hopefully the fans get an opportunity to celebrate an early Valentine's Day gift with their loved ones by having the Rockets beat them at home in Houston again, February 13th there. And then, just for good measure, to see if the Rockets play the Warriors again for the rest of the season, which they do April 6th at Golden State. So Houston's got 3 more opportunities to put an end to the winning streak. December 11th, which is next Wednesday, potentially a game that the Rockets could win since it's at their home court. Then you have February 13th, another home game for the Rockets. And then the Rockets have April the 6th. So those are the 3 dates in which Houston has a chance to put an end to this ridiculous long 15-game losing streak. Now, you don't want to, eventually it's going to come to an end. But at some point, there does tend to be a pressure. And I feel like the Rockets, let's remind ourselves here. This is a very young team. This is a team that is still kind of building off, trying to build a team that can contend to be where the Warriors were or try to win championships. They're not in that position yet. And right now, Houston's going to have an experience where they're going to be dealing with some tough games. They got off to a great start this season. They're still 15-8 or 16-8 as their record. But you just know at some point that the streak is going to come to an end and the Rockets will beat the Golden State Warriors. The question is, when is that going to happen? I think the reality is having a dominance over a certain team is enjoyable, but there's also that level of pressure that comes with it. Comparing it to some other winning streaks. I remember watching a documentary about the 1994 New York Rangers, and that team won the Stanley Cup after 54 years without winning a game. There was one topic in which the Rangers were talked about. That was the topic in which they hadn't beaten the New York Islanders at the Islanders' home place in 5 years. And you just had to think that it's really frustrating and really disappointing for Ranger fans who went to a Nassau Coliseum, which is where the Islanders played before they moved to a new stadium, and not being able to win a game there for 5 years until that season in '94. They finally won a game at the Nassau Coliseum, and that proved to be a big stepping stone for them because eventually they made the playoffs and they would go on to sweep the Islanders in the playoffs. So to put an end to that streak was definitely huge for that Rangers team. Now, I think if the Rockets are to be taken seriously as a legitimate contender, they have to beat the Golden State Warriors. Now, whether that happens in the playoffs is one thing, but I'm talking about getting a small victory by putting an end to this ridiculous long losing streak. Because trust me, folks, when the Rockets do beat Golden State, now I don't know when that's going to be, and I'm hoping it's this year or this season and not have to wait another long season. When the Rockets do beat the Warriors, it's going to be a joyous occasion because finally the losing streak is over. Houston has won for at least one day, and that gives them a confidence that they can beat the Golden State Warriors because they're still the team that's up there while Golden State is kind of still a team that is on top. So eventually the Houston Rockets will beat the Golden State Warriors at some point. But it's just so frustrating to remind yourself of how far the team has transitioned from in this losing streak. Because they were a bad team, the Rockets. I mean, I talked about briefly how, the Rockets just weren't that good. I mean, coaching was a problem. They didn't have Ime Udoka for a period. They were still working on some of the players to get. And then there were some questions as to whether or not Jalen Green, who, let's be fair, has been very inconsistent at times, whether he's been, really going to be the franchise guy or if he's going to be traded. And right now the Rockets are still trying to figure things out with him. Then, of course, you added guys like Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks, who were really there to bring veteran leadership, not necessarily to win a championship in my mind, but guys that can really bring the intensity and the aggression. And eventually, at some point that this is probably going to be able to pay off for them. But the truth is, it's so frustrating, like when you have a team that can't beat a rival for 15 straight games. Trust me, I've been around this situation. In fact, where I'm working at right now, we have a team that has currently won 15-plus consecutive games over a rival of ours. And while that is enjoyable, at some point that it's going to come to an end. And you just hope that it's not there. Because eventually it's going to come. And it's going to sting. But obviously it doesn't change the landscape of the rivalry because you have been the more successful, dominant team. But that one loss could potentially turn into a momentum shifter for the series and the rivalry as well. So ideally, though, I would like to wish that the Rockets could beat the Warriors in the playoffs, and I hope that Steph Curry and Draymond Green are there. It may not necessarily erase the memories of the Warriors beating the Rockets the 4 times in the playoffs with Curry and Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson as well against James Harden and Chris Paul there for some times as well. But it really would be nice to have the Rockets beat the Warriors in a playoff series and say, now we're not going to be over for going against Golden State for a long time. That's something that I know Yankee fans are probably secretly hoping for when they play the Astros the next time in the playoffs. But then again, I don't know if the Yankees would be able to beat the Astros in the playoffs because they are 0-4 against the Astros in all playoffs all time. But to compare the Rockets situation with the Warriors situation, let's look at it from the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are like the Warriors, and the Bills are like the Rockets, or were like the Rockets. The Bills had some great regular season teams. Right now, they are arguably the best team in the AFC, but eventually, though, the Bills come up short against Golden State. They've lost to them 3. Why did I say Golden State? The Bills can't beat the Kansas City Chiefs in that sense. So Kansas City has beaten Buffalo 3 times in the playoffs, and Buffalo has to beat Kansas City if they want to get to the Super Bowl this year. And this is a good chance that they might be able to do that, but we'll have to wait and see on that as well. So my thing is, the Rockets will eventually beat the Golden State Warriors. And I know I've said that a couple of times. That's just a belief I have. But you have to take every loss as a reminder that it's a young team. They're still building on things. And the Warriors are still at the top. They may be falling at some areas, but eventually it's going to be a dogfight with trying to figure out a way to get the win. And you hope that the Rockets can beat them this season at some point, but we'll wait and see in that regards. Now, speaking of Houston, obviously the last few episodes I was referencing to the suspension of Al-Aziz Shair and how there's definitely been a very frustrated, angry look amongst the Texans fans and the players about the suspension. They think it's too harsh. They think it was unfair. That the NFL looked at some of the past things that Al-Shair did, and you can understand what happened in that regards or why that was the case, but I just think it was a little bit too harsh in a sense. I knew he would be suspended, but I didn't think it would be for 3, and I think it was a little bit unfair. Now, you could say that Trevor Lawrence going to the IR was a big factor in that decision, but eventually, it is what it is. Yet, Aziz Al-Shair posted on his Instagram, if you want me to be the villain, fine, I'll be the villain. And then he made a picture reference to the Joker, played by Joaquin Phoenix in the movie, which, by the way, if you want to win an Academy Award for Best Actor, play the Joker in the movie, because it worked with Heath Ledger and it worked with Joaquin Phoenix. I don't know why it didn't work for Jack Nicholson, though. Well, I guess Batman wasn't seen as an Oscar-worthy film back when it first aired in 1989. So, yeah. But anyway, obviously there's still that intensity, there's still that feeling of Houston versus everybody from the fan base as well. But interestingly enough, there has been an overwhelming support for Al-Aziz Shair, who has gotten his fair of supporters from former experts and players that basically say, yeah, it's a bad hit, it's very egregious, but the fact is that it's for 3 games, it's ridiculous. We shouldn't even look into having a history and all that. And what are we doing to prevent the linebackers? Because I think the NFL is being too lenient on quarterbacks and everything. So it does seem like Aziz Shair is getting his fair share of supporters, but ultimately he is going to be missing 3 games, which unfortunately is a big loss for the Texans because they're taking on the Miami Dolphins, the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Baltimore Ravens. And speaking of the Baltimore Ravens, I actually got done watching or rewatching the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary about the Baltimore Ravens from 2000. The Bullies of Baltimore is what it's called. And when you think about the 2000 Ravens, that is arguably one of, if not the greatest defense in the history of the NFL. Fewest points allowed. That's a record that may never be touched again. They had the Defensive Player of the Year in Ray Lewis. They went on to finish with an 11-game winning streak. And then, of course, they dominated the Super Bowl, defeated the New York Giants 34-7. But bear in mind, folks, that score, 34-7, is deceiving because it wasn't the defense that gave up the touchdown. It was special teams that gave up the touchdown. So you got to remember about that. It was Ahmad Dixon who ran a touchdown back in the Super Bowl, but the defense pitched the shutout, okay? The special teams was the one that committed the error. But at the end of the day, it was one of the most dominant performances by a team that won a Super Bowl, 34-7 the final score. Ray Lewis, of course, won Super Bowl MVP, and, well, yeah, it was just a remarkable team to watch and look back in hindsight. But anyways, I was watching this documentary, and I was rewatching it, and you know what hit me? I realized, oh my gosh, there are some comparisons here between this Baltimore Ravens team, or that Baltimore Ravens team of 2000, and the current Houston Texans squad. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Are you crazy? Are you stupid or delusional? You hypocrite, you idiots! How can you compare this Houston Texans team that's currently 8-5 to this Baltimore Ravens squad that apparently, won the Super Bowl with arguably the greatest defense in the history of the NFL. How can you compare that team, the Ravens, to the Texans of this current era? That's a very good question, and I am questioning that myself at times. However, when you think about the circumstances of the team, you'll find out that there are some similarities. Now, it's not all the similarities are, it's not very similar. It's not like it's a repeat of what's happening there, But here's why I think that, Texans are compared to the Ravens at sometimes. When you think about the Ravens of that year, they had some drama. And Ray Lewis, who was a Hall of Fame player, one of the greatest linebackers of all time, in the offseason, prior to the start of the season, he got himself arrested because of an alleged murder that took place. And, people still say, well, Ray Lewis was the one that did it. He got away with this, yada, yada, yada. He, the charges of murder and homicide were dropped, but he did plead guilty of a misdemeanor, of obstruction of justice and everything. And there, regardless of, what the situation was, Ray Lewis was going to have a lot of people following him. And it's one of those things that that's hard on an athlete. Like, even if you're innocent, even if you didn't commit the crime, the fact that you were there and there's a lot of people that are going to question you, it's going to be with him for the rest of his life, and he knows that. But ultimately, Ray Lewis was able to make the most of, was able to overcome that, and, he had one of the best seasons of an NFL player from a defensive perspective. He was named the Defensive Player of the Year and, Super Bowl MVP. And certainly when you look back at that situation, you can understand, it wasn't a social media related event. If it had been, Lewis would have probably gotten more flack than he did in the NFL. Now, personally, I don't think he did it. I don't think he committed the crime, but he was there. And I think Ray Lewis has definitely gotten himself, has managed to redeem himself in a way. But if there's new evidence that suggests otherwise, then yeah, I think we would all be, disappointed in a sense. But, so you had all this drama with the Ray Lewis thing. Recently, though, there hasn't been a murder. No one from the Texans has been allegedly done anything crime-related. But Aziz Al-Shaair has been, in some hot water. Like, he has been the most hated football player. And you have a bunch of his teammates defending him, and the organization has defended him, saying, that's not who he is. Yes, he made a mistake, but that's not his character. And when you attack his character, that's pretty much bull crap in a way, Nick Caserio used a different term, but I'm not going to say it just because this is a PG-related show. I mean, I might have said it once or twice before. But in a sense, the whole fact that Aziz Shaair is the one that's been, a hated football player because of what he did to Trevor Lawrence, which has gotten him 3 games suspended. And you have all these Texans players defending him and, really expressing their frustration and disappointment with how the NFL handled the whole situation there. It's almost like the Ravens defending Ray Lewis. Obviously, it was almost like they were around him. They rallied around him, He was their leader. He was the one that, told them prior to the start of the season, I need to get to Tampa to play in the Super Bowl, because I feel that way. And Ray Lewis did see the movie Gladiator, and Russell Crowe's performance of Maximus was one of the best performances, and he used that as motivation to, help lead the Ravens all the way as well. So what you have here is a situation where it was Baltimore versus everybody in 2000, just like it's becoming Houston versus everybody, although maybe it's a little bit over-dramatized for this occasion in comparison to the situation with the Astros and everything, which, I'll say it again, cheating or not, it wouldn't have made a difference because the Astros were still going to win it that year. Deal with it. But going back to the whole, the thing with Ray Lewis here, the Ravens, became a hated team because that was a team that had a lot of personalities and a lot of characters, interesting people. You had Shannon Sharpe, the tight end, who had signed a deal to join the Ravens after winning 2 Super Bowls with the Denver Broncos. You had Jamal Lewis, who was the running back, a great talented player. You had Rod Woodson, a former Pittsburgh Steelers player, as a safety. Now he joins the Ravens, looking to win a Super Bowl. Then you had Tony Siragusa, the late Tony Siragusa, who passed away a couple years ago. This big defensive line who he was a big guy. He had a lot of swagger and ability to talk back. But man, he was the kind of guy that looked like a guy that could be a bodyguard, but in a way talk a lot of smack and everything. And just you know how he is, a New Jersey guy. Those New Jersey guys with the tough attitude, the swagger, and everything. But yeah, he was a character for them, of course. And then of course Trent Dilfer, the quarterback for the Ravens, who was not an elite quarterback, who kind of played it safe and very conservatively, but he was a good leader for the Ravens as well for that season from an offensive perspective. Now, they had some characters on the team, probably more villainous and more cocky with swagger than the Texans do, although you can say Houston's culture has changed somewhat. You have players trying to be more accountable towards each other. You have guys that are kind of expressing themselves, but also playing with a chip on their shoulder in a way. And that just shows how effective and aggressive the team is, at least on the defensive side. Of course, we talk about the Ravens defense and their records. The Texans defense don't have the numbers that the Ravens have, given their record. However, Houston's defense has shown to be aggressive. You look at Derek Stingley Jr. I know it was a D, but Derek Stingley Jr. I keep forgetting about that. Derek Stingley Jr., probably one of the best cornerbacks in the game. Will Anderson Jr. Showing that aggressive side, being more aggressive off the ball. You then throw in all these other great players, the additions that the Texans brought to the team. Even Azeez Al-Shaair, before the whole suspension, played a big role in a way. And Jalen Petrie, I know he's out for a couple games with the shoulder situation, and you hope that he comes back to finish the season. But he has been, just a remarkable, talented player, I think, with the whole getting adjusted to the system. So the Texans have players that can play defensively. They're not the best defense in the NFL like the Ravens were, but they have an aggressive side and that capability to them. A third reason why the Texans are somewhat similar to the 2000 Ravens, there was a period for a month in 2000 where the Ravens didn't score an offensive touchdown. The Ravens won a couple of games that season. In fact, looking at their schedule, from, I want to say, October the 1st to October 29th, the entire month of October, the Ravens did not score a single touchdown in a game. They went 2-3 because they had a good kicking game. They beat the Browns 12-0. They beat the Jaguars 15-10, but then they lost to the Washington Redskins, they lost to the Tennessee Titans, and they lost to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Scores with only 3, 6, and 6 points. So the Ravens did not get double figures. They didn't even score some touchdowns, and it was just so frustrating. But finally, they won against the Cincinnati Bengals 27-7, and eventually they were able to carry that momentum to win their next 10 games after that, which included the Super Bowl. So, it's gotten me to thinking, like, the Texans' offense has been, in the first half, they've been very electric, very good, but the second half, they have not. And there was a period where, I want to say after week 6, until the Cowboys game, the Texans did not score a touchdown in the second half. And that, you can kind of understand some comparisons here. Like the second half touchdowns, obviously they pale in comparison to an entire game, but certainly you need to score touchdowns in the second half if you want to have a chance to win. There have been times where the Texans dominated the first half, but then they faltered in the second half. Or they might be keeping it close around the second half, but can't get that touchdown needed to score. And eventually, the Texans have lost those games. And there's not that's just the nature of football sometimes. But I know the fans in Houston have been very upset and very frustrated with the lack of offensive production in the second half. We know C.J. Stroud is a great quarterback, but this year he's kind of regressed. You can call it a sophomore slump, if you will. I think last time I checked, he had 14 touchdown passes and 9 interceptions. Maybe he added another one, 15 this season, or 15 and 10. So it's definitely not been the best year for him. But, part of that reason is, well, maybe he's struggling. Part of that is probably the offensive line not doing a great job protecting Stroud. Part of it's probably on the coaching staff, Bobby Slowick. We were hoping that he can elevate Stroud to a whole new level, and all of a sudden, it's just not been that way. And it's just, it just makes you think about that stretch that the Ravens went through. Eventually, the Baltimore Ravens made a change. They had Tony Banks as a starting quarterback at the start of the year, but when Banks was struggling, they ended up going to Trent Dilfer. And Dilfer, again, not an elite quarterback, but he did lead them to, he ended up finishing the undefeated record. Like, he was undefeated for the rest of the season. So now, if you're the Texans, you have to think, okay, they were able to break through and get some offensive touchdowns in the second half. Now the question becomes, can you use that as motivation to get yourself on a playoff run? And there's been some interesting conversations about what the Texans really need to do. Well, for starters, they are 8-5. Let's remember that. They are sitting at 8-5, and they are currently in first place over the Indianapolis Colts. So looking at the standings here, it's a 2-game lead. However, the Texans' schedule is not easy. You had the Dolphins, the Chiefs, and the Ravens. 3 teams that will be tough games to get some wins. The last game of the season is against the Tennessee Titans, and certainly the Texans will want to get revenge on Tennessee. But then you look at Indianapolis' last few games. Their schedule is more favorable to them than it is with Houston. Indianapolis has Denver. That's a game that could be really tough for them to win, because Denver is also fighting for a playoff spot with Bo Nix and company. But then you got Tennessee, which is a home game for them. Then you have the New York Giants in New York, and then the Jacksonville Jaguars. So you look at the schedule, the Colts can go 3-1, while the Texans, worst case scenario for them would go 1-3, and the Colts would overtake the Texans, which would mean that they would win the division, and which may not be enough for Houston to get into the playoffs, which would really be a crushing blow for this Texans team. So clearly the Texans have to look at this upcoming stretch and say, hey, we got to get ourselves together because we are fighting for a playoff spot. Now, Houston does not have enough pieces to be considered a Super Bowl contending team this season. But then again, a lot of people were picking against the Baltimore Ravens even in the playoffs. It was their first trip to the postseason, and the Ravens ended up winning 3 games en route to the Super Bowl. That included 2 road victories, one against Tennessee, the other against Oakland. So, you might be looking at a situation where the Texans might have to take a similar road to Baltimore, or a similar road like Baltimore, win a home wildcard playoff game, which at this point, if the Texans were to, start the playoffs right now, they would be hosting the Los Angeles Chargers in the first game, which would be a tough game. No, don't get me wrong. But if you win that game, you then have to go on the road to take on the top team in the AFC, which right now is the Kansas City Chiefs. And if you somehow win that game, you then have to go on the road again, probably to Buffalo, probably to Baltimore, or maybe Pittsburgh. Let's not forget about the Steelers. The Steelers are still first place in the AFC North. So right now you're looking at this and you think, man, this kind of has a feeling like this is a case where the Texans could have a similar run to Baltimore in terms of, all they went through. But not only that, the Texans have, I don't want to say they've been the most villainous team in all of the NFL, even though the last few days have not been so kind to them, given all that has happened. But you got to have this feeling that the Texans at some point are going to take this whole it's us against the world mentality, which I'm a little bit mixed on that. But at the same time, I feel like at some point Houston has had that throughout its entire time. I know other sports cities have had that mentality. Philadelphia had it. Detroit has it. Chicago at times. And I know Buffalo would have it as well, even though they haven't won a professional championship since 1963, or I may be a little bit off. It might have been 63 or 64. Probably 64. But Buffalo hasn't won a professional championship since then. And, they've had 4 Super Bowl opportunities but lost. And then, they had a controversial Stanley Cup Finals, lost to Dallas in 99, but that's a story for another day. So, I mean, every city at some point has an us against the world mentality. But Houston kind of feels like it's had that lately, and for, understandable reasons. And, of course, I always felt like, hey, that 30 for 30 documentary that's going to come out about this whole period where Houston was seen as villainous, as the bad guy, in reality played the role of Robin Hood to perfection, or in a way they kind of took the role of Wyatt Earp from Tombstone, where, they basically said, you tell him I'm coming, and hell is coming with me, you hear? Hell is coming with me. I mean, I can't do the whole Kurt Russell voice now because it's, late in the night, and I'm trying to, get myself ready for bed and everything. But, you think about that. You think about the whole us against the world mentality, and that's something that could play well into the Texans' favor if they are able to play well and pick up some wins in the playoffs. Now, obviously, you haven't earned the right to be a playoff team, and that was another key factor in the Ravens documentary that I watched, where they weren't a playoff team and had to work to get that so much that they couldn't even say the word playoffs while they were seeking a playoff spot. So that's something maybe the Texans should do. Don't say the P word. Don't say playoffs. That might be a good idea. But then, of course, it seemed like everywhere the Ravens went, when they got to the Super Bowl, when the Ravens did, most of the attention was on Ray Lewis for obvious reasons. And the way that Brian Billick handled that, you look back in hindsight and think, man, he could have probably done things a little bit differently. But, dude, that's definitely something that social media would hit up. Here's a coach that's willing to defend his team very well, expressing, his displeasure with the way the media, who refuses to let go of something that happened the previous year and all that. And, I mean, the media can be a dirty job sometimes. And I know they have jobs to do and everything, but sometimes it's like the media does not want Ray Lewis, or didn't want Ray Lewis and the Ravens to win. They picked the Giants overwhelmingly, even though the Ravens believed in their hearts that they were the better team and they were going to prove it, which they did. But sometimes, you think it's a dirty mentality. Now, I'm not saying the Texans are going to get as much hate coverage, because there's going to be people, like if the Texans make the Super Bowl, people are going to be talking about C.J. Stroud and what he's meant to this franchise and his ability to, express his faith on the field and, in post-game pressers and all of that, and how he's had to overcome some struggles in this season and everything. They're going to be talking about that. They're probably going to be talking about Nico Collins, in his play and his performance, and certainly some key defenders for the Texans, and also how the Texans were able to pull off this incredible run. But you can't deny that there's going to be talk about Azeez Al-Shaair and the controversial hit, which really has been a social media topic over these last few days. Like, was it a legal hit? Was it egregious? Which, my opinion on that. It was egregious, but was the suspension fair? And certainly he is definitely putting himself in that villain role, and that's going to make this Super Bowl, if the Texans make it, really interesting. Now, I'm not saying they're going to make it this year, but I'm saying in a hypothetical situation for this season, if the Texans are to be like the Ravens, there's going to be some drama that's going to be talked about, the whole suspension thing. Of course, the key difference, the big thing that for the Texans to be like the Ravens would be they would have to win the Super Bowl. But, again, hypothetical talk, we still got ways to go. We'll see what happens out in the season. But I just thought, hey, I watched the Baltimore documentary. I thought it was really interesting again. And I just say, there's probably some similarities here. But those are the only real similarities I could really find. Now, again, the Ravens defense, much better than the Texans defense. And certainly the Ravens, that year, probably better than this Texans team right now. But, hey, you never know. The Texans could surprise and go on this incredible run. But we'll wait and see on that as well. So that is going to wrap up this edition of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with the K-Rock. I know that I was not planning on doing a third episode this week, especially one of Houston sports, but I felt like I got to get my mind off a couple of things here, just some things that I saw, things that I talked about as well. But hopefully next week we'll be able to get ourselves back on track with episode 49 of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with the K-Rock. And hopefully I can convince Mark T. Robinson to get back to work on Two Pals on a Pod with, Mark and K-Rock here. So hopefully that plays out very well over the next few weeks. But anyways, folks, thank you guys for listening in. If you want to listen to this podcast or comment on it below, please go to my YouTube channel once again, KWCline 91, KW Cline 91, that is. And also to Spotify and Podbean. I should have this podcast out in really soon, and I will see you guys next time on another episode of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping.